An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Morning, everybody. Last week's talk was based on the Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, the book we're using now from Thich Nhat Hanh, written by Thich Nhat Hanh. And last week's talk was mostly focused on the first and the second of the Four Noble Truths, looking at them from what Thich Nhat Hanh calls the 12 turnings of the Dharma wheel, 3 turns for each of the 4 Noble Truths. And he recognizes those as being recognition, encouragement, and realization. And just a quick reminder, in our working with the first Noble Truth, the existence of suffering, there is a recognition that something is causing us some kind of pain or uneasiness or fear, for example. And perhaps we can identify it at this stage. Maybe we can say, oh, this is a physical feeling or a psychological feeling, but we're acknowledging it. It's in us and we're not running away from it. And the second turning was the encouragement to take a much closer look, to take a deep look into the causes and to be willing and have the intention to understand them. So this to me feels like bringing a curiosity for discovery to our own suffering. And the third turning is the realization that this suffering has been understood. We can name it probably, maybe identify some aspects of it. And similarly, he talked about the first turning of the second Noble Truth, saying that the causes of suffering, that actually recognition is that we continue to create suffering for ourselves, and that we could look deeply at the nature of it to see what exactly, and he called them nutriments, we have been feeding ourselves. The second turning, encouragement, helps us to understand that if we stop those behaviors, we can be happy. And a happiness that from within that radiates outward. And we begin to see the nature of suffering. And actually, as we begin to see it, it shows us the way out. And lastly, then, is the realization, the third turning of the second Noble Truth, in which we not only vow to stop ingesting that which creates suffering, but we do stop. And we start ingesting that which feeds us in a non-harmful way, that which is healthy for us. So we can enter into a stage that is not causing harm to ourselves or to others. And it's in the next chapter, chapter 8, that Thich Nhat Hanh continues in this way with the other 2 truths. And he actually calls this chapter Realizing Well-Being. But before we look at those, you might remember last week, there was a comment about how important it is for us to remember that we also should appreciate the non-suffering in our lives, the beauty and the happiness. And Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes this often in his writing. And in fact, he gave a similar example, as was mentioned last week, about the importance of this when working with patients and clients. And specifically in his case, he was talking about psychotherapists. But the importance of serving people in ways that open them to touching the seeds of happiness, in his words, that are also there. And just as he encourages therapists to practice walking meditation and tea meditation with their clients, so do we also obviously benefit, of course, from a mindfulness that recognizes our own happiness and our own joy. And so entering into the third noble truth, Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes the importance of our own discovery of what nourishes joy in us and joy in others. He suggests that through the work we've already done with the first two noble truths, that we already have happiness, actually, but perhaps we just don't know it yet. And so the third noble truth, traditionally called the cessation of suffering, helps us understand that we can transform suffering. And it shows us that well-being is not only possible, it's available to each of us. So the first turning is our recognition that, in fact, well-being is possible. There is a possibility of the cessation of suffering and the possibility of peace and happiness. And he reminds us that even if we do not feel happiness at a particular moment, we can always tap into joy that we've experienced in our lives that is still within us. And this relates to the second turning, encouragement. We can acknowledge wholeheartedly what brings us joy, experience it deeply, whether it's planting bulbs or walking a mountain path, riding a bike, friends, or fixing a meal for family. We can jump in and we can feel the connection with joy in our hearts and know this is always available to us. Thich Nhat Hanh makes a beautiful comment related to this. He writes, quote, "We can put an end to our suffering just by realizing that our suffering is not worth suffering for." And this reminds me of what was shared last week about our minds being a library, and that includes stories of our lives and how often we choose the book that has the hurtful story, a story that could be decades old. But this is our chance. That book is not worth the suffering it causes, he says. Look at it closely, smile at it, touch it deeply, don't run away from it, but know that it's not worth suffering for. And then we can lovingly return it back to the library. And in this way, we can then experience the third turning, realization. A realization that suffering and happiness are not two. And of course, there are times when our suffering is so great, so unbearable, that we cannot really imagine the possibility of happiness or joy. I saw this often in hospice, where a hospice patient was actually very much at peace and very much filled with joy, as one example, returning to God, whereas the family member was struck with unimaginable grief. We think that there is only suffering and that happiness is planted in some other time or place, but that's not true, really. We know that things can cause us to suffer. They can actually bring great joy to others at the same time. And even rather small annoyances point this out to us every day. Before I moved to the mountains and I lived in town, there were times when I was so annoyed to distraction at the music that my neighbor was playing because the bass was so loud. All of my windows would be, it was an old house, all of my windows would be rattling. And pretty much I could only hear their music and their bass endlessly on and on. And not that it was that often, I must admit. But a few times I marched over to my neighbor and asked them, please just turn down the bass, please turn it down a little bit. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they told me pretty much to go fly a kite. But I was always reminded of those moments when I played my own music, too loud, no doubt, but neighbors not asking me to turn it down. And they're quite simply things that bring us joy that annoy others. And I remember also some time ago, I was on an Easter Sunday with our family on the ranch of my cousin. And everybody had laid this beautiful array of food out on tables, and everybody was sitting around and enjoying each other, and went from a sunny day to a cloudy day, and then the clouds just burst out in rain. And I remember so many people say, oh man, just ruined everything. And my cousin's standing there going, oh boy, we need this so bad. And it's like that, right? In small ways that that happens every day, and certainly huge moments like death. So happiness is always existing alongside suffering. And our practice helps us recognize our pain, stay with it without running away and avoiding it. And it creates space in which we can recognize the coexistence of joy in the same moment. And Thich Nhat Hanh says that, quote, the way to suffer well, really love that, the way to suffer well and be happy is to stay in touch with what is actually going on. And in doing so, you will gain liberating insights into the true nature of suffering and joy. And so he comes to the final, fourth noble truth, the way out of suffering. And so first we're recognizing, the first turning, that the Noble Eightfold Path is a path that leads us out of suffering. And then we encourage ourselves to practice this path. Realize this through learning, reflecting, practicing, he says. And it is not true learning unless it is followed by reflecting and practicing. When I read this, I thought about the time that I was practicing in the Theravadan tradition. And in the late 1990s, I visited Abhayagiri Monastery, which is in Northern California near Ukiah. And this is a monastery in the Theravadan Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Chah, who some of you might be familiar with. But every afternoon, as is really common in Thai monasteries, practitioners can meet briefly with the abbot to ask a question. So one day I was sort of lined up, waiting patiently as others chatted with him, and finally he turned to me and just said a few things like, where are you from and how long will you be staying with us and so forth. And then he fell silent. And what was on my mind that day was my difficulty at actualizing a practice that was beyond just me sitting alone at home. Meditating, yes. Reading, yes. But with no contact or interaction with others about what I was doing or learning. I was really needing to meet Sangha and teacher at that time. And I was reading and reading and reading, and sitting and sitting and sitting. But really, I wanted his help on how to move forward. And he said a few words. And then he said, we have a saying in Buddhism. First, you read about it, the it being Buddhism and Dharma. First, you read about it. Then you practice it. Then you live it. Then you become it. And somehow, this opened up the path really wide for me. First of all, just the fact that there is a saying about this, there's a shared reality about this situation. And I could see a path now. And it's not necessarily a linear experience, even though it sounds like it. So I'm reading, living, practicing, back to reading. It's a path of learning and reflection and living it and being it. All of our suffering and our joy. And it's a path we need. And this leads us to the last turning. The realization that we are practicing the Eightfold Path. And in his words, Thich Nhat Hanh, we must be determined to transform our difficulties to confirm that well-being is possible. And as many of you know, Thich Nhat Hanh speaks often of the importance of interbeing. And it's true with regard to the Four Noble Truths. When we see one truth, we see them all. In his words, we need suffering in order to see the path. And the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path leading to this cessation are all found in the heart of suffering. And the Buddha said, the moment you know how your suffering came to be, you are already on the path to release it. And so here we all are on this path, touching and embracing our own suffering and the suffering of others, turning towards it, while also recognizing our path of joy and liberation. And as all of you know, traditionally and true today, the Four Noble Truths are often expressed as what Thich Nhat Hanh how he has expressed them. The truth of suffering, the truth of the origins of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. But I wanted to share other expressions that have a place in modern Buddhism today. And here in our Zendo, over the years, we have often discussed aspects of our practice related to social issues and environmental issues. And so I offer this version from Reverend Lynn Shutt, who's a Dharma heir of Blanche Hartman in the tradition of Suzuki Roshi, which is our lineage as well. And for her, the Four Noble Truths are framed as active engagement in the world. And here are the four, according to Reverend Shutt. Number one, harm and harming is present. Number two, it's possible to understand the causes and conditions for harm and harming. And she asks, what familial, cultural, systemic structure promoted, reinforced, or perpetuated this? Her third, individual and collective agency is possible to end harm and harming. And again, a question to us. Conditions can change, and we can be part of it. What can we do to be agents of change? And fourthly, the Eightfold Path empowers wholeness. How can we practice to actively engage with these 8 aspects of restorative ways? And also, I would like to share some of the wisdom that is found on our bulletin board here in the Zendo. We should send a picture out to all of you. But I'm not sure of the source of this, but I'm going to share it with you. So this is called The Four Noble Truths for a 4-year-old. So number 1, sometimes people feel sad. Sometimes the thing that makes people sad is not getting something they want or getting something they don't want. There's a way not to be so sad about not getting what you want or getting what you don't want. And 4, the way is to not think so much about what you want at all, but instead think about how you can be kind and helpful to your family, your teachers, your friends, other people, animals, bugs, and everything that lives. Very sweet. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh would agree with the essence of both of these versions. And in fact, he suggests a reframing of his own for modern times, he says. And so think of this. Number 1, the new number 1 for Thich Nhat Hanh is there is well-being. And traditionally, that would be number 3, cessation of suffering, the possibility of well-being. So there's well-being. Number 2, the new number 2, there is the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to well-being. And that would be traditionally number 4. His new number 3, there is suffering, traditionally number 1. And his new number 4, there is the ignoble Eightfold Path that leads to suffering. So this would be wrong view, as an example, wrong mind. And that is traditionally number 2, the causes of suffering. And this chapter ends with him reminding us that living according to the Noble Eightfold Path cultivates a life filled with joy and ease and wonder. However, by following a path that is not noble, the ignoble path, filled with attachments and ignorance and fear, etc., we will suffer. And so we practice, facing our own suffering and the suffering of others, with intention to cultivate well-being, our own, that of others, and that of our world.